At 22:30 hours on the night of August 7th, 1942, Private First Class Edward Ahrens crouched in a foxhole on Tulagi Island, clutching what his fellow raiders called his Souvenir sword, a captured Japanese officer's blade that weighed less than 3 pounds and had never drawn blood. At 22 years old and barely 140 pounds, he looked more like a farm boy from Dayton, Kentucky than an elite Marine raider, and for 6 weeks his comrades had joked that his prize sword was nothing more than expensive metal, useless against rifles and grenades. When Ahrens had first shown the blade to Major Lewis Walt back at training, Walt had asked if he planned to fight a medieval war, and the other Marines laughed when Ahrens practiced drawing it from its sheath during quiet moments. They carried Thompson submachine guns, Springfield rifles, and fragmentation grenades, modern weapons for a modern war, while Ahrens obsessed over an antique that belonged in a museum, not a battlefield. The 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force didn't care about his sword either as they launched their nighttime infiltration attack, slipping through the darkness in small groups, aiming to drive a wedge between Company A and Company C and sweep up the ridge toward the Raider command post. Japanese soldiers moved like ghosts through the jungle, armed with Arisaka rifles and Type 97 grenades, confident that their coordinated assault would crush the American perimeter before dawn. They expected to face Marines with modern firearms in defensive positions, not hand-to-hand combat with a blade forged in the previous century. As rifle fire erupted across the ridge and grenades exploded in the darkness, Ahrens found himself cut off from his unit, surrounded in his foxhole as enemy soldiers closed in from all sides. His rifle jammed, his ammunition ran low, and the muzzle flashes grew closer with each passing second. That's when the farm boy from Kentucky reached for his Souvenir, and 13 Japanese soldiers learned that some weapons never go out of style. The first wave of landing craft hit the coral beaches of Tulagi Island at 0600 hours on August 7th, 1942, their steel hulls grinding against the reef as Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion prepared to storm ashore into what intelligence had promised would be a bloodbath. Private First Class Edward Ahrens, hunched in the second wave alongside 30 other raiders from Company A, felt the familiar weight of his captured Japanese sword pressing against his hip beneath his cartridge belt, the leather-wrapped handle worn smooth from months of nervous handling during training exercises back at New River. The other Marines around him carried standard issue gear, Springfield rifles, Thompson submachine guns, fragmentation grenades, and bayonets, the tools of modern warfare that had served American forces from France to the Philippines. As the landing craft's ramp dropped with a metallic clang, Major Lewis Walt's voice cut through the diesel engine noise and surf crash, ordering his men forward into knee-deep water that felt surprisingly warm against their leggings. Ahrens splashed ashore with the others, his rifle held high above the waves, expecting the crack of sniper fire or the whistle of incoming mortars that had turned other Pacific landings into slaughter pens. Instead, silence greeted them, an eerie quiet broken only by the sound of boots on coral and the distant call of tropical birds in the jungle canopy above. The Marines advanced inland down the right slope of Tulagi's central ridge, moving in tactical formation through dense vegetation that seemed to swallow sound and limit visibility to just a few yards in any direction. Company A took the right flank, while Company C moved up the center, both units expecting fierce resistance from the 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force that had occupied the island since May. Intelligence reports had warned of prepared positions, machine gun nests, and at least 400 Japanese defenders ready to fight to the death, rather than surrender their strategic foothold in the Solomon Islands chain. But as the morning wore on and the raiders pushed deeper into the island's interior, they encountered nothing more threatening than abandoned foxholes and scattered equipment. The Japanese had apparently withdrawn to prepared positions deeper inland, conceding the beaches and waiting for the Americans to advance into killing zones where their superior knowledge of terrain would prove decisive. For Ahrens, the quiet felt more ominous than reassuring. He had trained for immediate, violent contact, not this ghostly advance through empty jungle, where every shadow might conceal an enemy soldier. By afternoon, Company A had established positions west of a cricket ground that the British colonial administration had maintained before the war, the manicured grass now overgrown with tropical weeds, but still recognizable as a playing field. The incongruity struck Ahrens as absurd. Civilized sport in the middle of a combat zone, afternoon tea replaced by ammunition checks and perimeter security. Major Walt positioned his men along the ridgeline, creating interlocking fields of fire that would theoretically stop any Japanese counterattack, though the thick vegetation made long-range shooting nearly impossible. As evening approached, Ahrens found himself assigned to a security detachment tasked with protecting the company's right flank, the most vulnerable position in their defensive line. He shared a foxhole with 2 other Marines, both veterans of pre-war service who had volunteered for raider training because they wanted to see real action rather than garrison duty. When Aarons mentioned his Japanese sword during the long hours of digging their position, Corporal Martinez from San Antonio laughed and asked if he planned to charge enemy machine guns. Like some medieval knight. The mockery was good-natured, but pointed. Raiders prided themselves on being modern warriors, masters of amphibious assault tactics and close-quarters battle techniques that emphasized firepower and aggressive movement. Swords belonged in museums or movies, not on Pacific battlefields where rifles could kill at 400 yards and artillery shells could obliterate entire squads without warning. Aarons had acquired the weapon during training exercises in Virginia, trading cigarettes and candy bars to a Navy intelligence officer who had brought it back from some earlier Pacific action, but he had never explained to his fellow Marines why he felt compelled to carry it into combat. As twilight deepened into full darkness, the jungle around their positions came alive with sounds that could have been wind through leaves or enemy soldiers moving through undergrowth. The Marines had been trained to expect night attacks. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific had demonstrated a preference for darkness, using superior knowledge of local terrain to infiltrate American positions and create chaos through close-range assaults that negated American advantages in firepower and air support. Aarons checked his rifle for the 10th time since sunset, ensuring the bolt operated smoothly, and his magazines were fully loaded with the 8-round clips that fed the Springfield's internal mechanism. His Thompson submachine gun lay beside him in the foxhole, its drum magazine containing 50 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition that could empty in less than 5 seconds of sustained fire. The Japanese sword rested against the foxhole's rear wall, its scabbard dark against the tropical soil that still radiated heat from the day's sun. Around midnight, the first sounds of movement reached their position, branches breaking under careful footsteps, the soft rustle of equipment being repositioned, and what might have been whispered conversations in a language none of the Americans understood. Major Walt had warned them that the Japanese would likely probe their lines during the night, testing for weak points and gathering intelligence about American defensive positions before launching coordinated attacks designed to break through and reach the battalion command post established in the old British Residency building. The waiting became almost unbearable as minutes stretched into hours without clear contact. Aarons found himself gripping his rifle so tightly that his knuckles ached, while sweat dripped steadily from his forehead despite the cooling night air. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound carried potential threat, and the absolute darkness beyond their position concealed dangers that could materialize without warning. The other Marines in nearby foxholes maintained strict noise discipline, communicating through hand signals and whispered words that barely carried more than a few feet. Then, at 22:30 hours exactly, the silence shattered as rifle fire erupted from multiple directions around the perimeter, muzzle flashes strobing through the darkness like deadly fireflies as the 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force launched their coordinated night assault on the raider positions. The initial burst of gunfire came from 3 directions simultaneously, suggesting the Japanese had spent hours maneuvering into position around the raider perimeter before launching their coordinated assault. Aarons pressed himself against the forward wall of his foxhole as tracer rounds streaked overhead, their phosphorus trails creating brief orange streaks against the star-filled sky above Tulagi's ridgeline. The distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the deeper boom of American Springfields as both sides engaged targets they could barely see in the absolute darkness of the tropical night. Major Walt's voice carried across the position from somewhere near the company command post, shouting orders that were nearly drowned out by the sustained rifle fire and the occasional sharp explosion of hand grenades. The Japanese were not conducting a single massed assault, but rather multiple infiltration attempts designed to probe for weaknesses in the American defensive line, slip through gaps between foxholes, and create confusion that would allow follow-up forces to exploit any breakthrough. This was the tactical doctrine that had served Japanese forces well throughout their conquests in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. Avoid frontal attacks against prepared positions, instead using darkness and superior fieldcraft to get inside the enemy's decision cycle. From his position on the right flank, Aarons could see muzzle flashes winking in the jungle approximately 100 yards to his front, indicating that at least one group of Japanese soldiers had established a firing position within effective range of the raider perimeter. His Springfield rifle had iron sights that were nearly useless in the darkness, forcing him to aim at muzzle flashes and hope his return fire would suppress enemy movement long enough for other Marines to reposition and establish better fields of fire. The 8-round clip in his rifle would empty quickly if he wasn't careful about target selection, and reloading under fire would leave him vulnerable for the several seconds required to strip a fresh clip into the weapon's internal magazine. Corporal Martinez, sharing the foxhole with Aarons and another Marine named Peterson from Oregon, had switched to his Thompson submachine gun after determining that precision rifle fire was impossible in the current conditions. The weapon's 50-round drum magazine could lay down suppressive fire that would keep enemy heads down, but its effective range was limited to perhaps 75 yards, and the .45 caliber bullets lacked the penetrating power to punch through jungle vegetation that might stop or deflect the projectiles before they reached their targets. The tactical trade-off between firepower and accuracy had become brutally apparent as the firefight developed into a chaotic exchange of shots at barely visible targets. 20 minutes into the engagement, the pattern of Japanese infiltration became clearer as small groups of enemy soldiers began appearing much closer to the raider positions than anyone had expected. These were not reconnaissance probes, but actual assault teams that had crawled through the jungle undergrowth, using natural cover and tactical patience to approach within grenade range of the American foxholes. The first indication came when a Type 97 fragmentation grenade exploded just 15 yards from Aarons's position, showering his foxhole with dirt and shrapnel that clanged off his helmet and cut shallow grooves in the wooden stock of his rifle. The explosion was followed immediately by the sound of running footsteps and shouted commands in Japanese as enemy soldiers rushed forward through the gap between Company A and Company C, exactly as intelligence had predicted they would attempt. Major Walt had positioned his strongest squad in this sector precisely because it represented the most likely avenue of approach, but the darkness and confusion had apparently allowed at least some Japanese forces to slip through the defensive line and establish positions in the raiders' rear area. This was every infantryman's nightmare: enemy forces inside the perimeter, firing from multiple directions, making it impossible to distinguish between friendly and hostile muzzle flashes. Aarons heard the distinctive sound of a Japanese Nambu machine gun opening fire from somewhere behind his position, its slower rate of fire easily distinguishable from the faster chatter of American weapons. The 6.5mm bullet snapped overhead with a sharp crack that indicated the gunner was firing directly at his foxhole, probably having identified it as a strong point that needed to be eliminated before the assault could continue. Peterson cursed and rolled to the bottom of their fighting position as bullets chewed chunks of coral and dirt from the foxhole's forward edge, forcing all 3 Marines to keep their heads down while the machine gun continued its methodical fire. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as more Japanese soldiers infiltrated the perimeter and began establishing firing positions that could support each other while suppressing American defensive fire. Company A's right flank was being systematically isolated from the rest of the battalion, cut off by enemy forces that had achieved exactly what their night attack doctrine was designed to accomplish. Individual Marine positions were now fighting for survival rather than conducting coordinated defensive operations, and communication between units had become nearly impossible due to the noise and confusion of close-quarters combat. Martinez attempted to call for support using the field telephone that connected their sector to the company command post, but the line had apparently been cut by shrapnel or enemy action during the initial exchange of fire. Without communications, the Marines on the right flank would have to hold their positions using only the ammunition and equipment they carried, with no possibility of resupply or reinforcement until daylight allowed better coordination of defensive efforts. The Japanese had clearly planned their assault to exploit exactly this weakness in American tactical doctrine: the dependence on centralized command and control that became a liability when communications broke down. As the firefight entered its second hour, Aarons realized that his rifle ammunition was running dangerously low, with only 2 8-round clips remaining in his cartridge belt after the sustained exchange of fire with barely visible targets. Every shot had to count now, but the darkness made precise marksmanship nearly impossible, forcing him to fire at muzzle flashes and hope that volume of fire would compensate for lack of accuracy. The psychological pressure of combat in absolute darkness was unlike anything he had experienced during training exercises, where blank ammunition and umpires had provided a safety net that obviously did not exist on Tulagi's contested ridge line. Peterson had been wounded by shrapnel from another Japanese grenade that exploded close enough to their position to shower the foxhole with metal fragments and chunks of coral. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, but it was bleeding steadily and would require medical attention that was simply not available under current circumstances. Martinez had used his last field dressing to bandage the injury, leaving them with no medical supplies if additional casualties occurred during what was clearly going to be a long and brutal night of fighting against an enemy that had achieved tactical surprise and local superiority. The third hour of fighting brought a shift in Japanese tactics as enemy soldiers abandoned their infiltration approach and began launching direct assaults against isolated Marine positions that had been cut off from mutual support. Ahrens watched through the darkness as muzzle flashes erupted from foxholes 50 yards to his left, indicating that other elements of Company A were engaged in desperate close-quarters battles with Japanese forces that had penetrated deep into the raider perimeter. The sound of hand-to-hand combat, screaming, cursing, the metallic clash of bayonets against rifle stocks, carried clearly through the humid night air, punctuated by the sharp crack of pistol shots and the duller thump of entrenching tools being used as weapons. Martinez had expended his last Thompson magazine during a furious exchange with Japanese soldiers who had approached within 20 yards of their position, forcing him to switch to his Springfield rifle and the handful of 8-round clips that remained in his cartridge belt. Peterson, weakened by blood loss from his shrapnel wounds, could barely maintain his position at the foxhole's edge, leaving Ahrens to cover the widest field of fire as enemy movement increased around their isolated position. The tactical mathematics were simple and brutal. 3 Marines with limited ammunition against an unknown number of Japanese soldiers who knew the terrain and could maneuver freely in the darkness that concealed their movements from American observers. The first direct assault on their foxhole came without warning, as 2 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle undergrowth just 10 yards away, close enough that Ahrens could see the bayonets fixed to their Arisaka rifles reflecting starlight as they charged toward the Marine position. He fired twice with his Springfield, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the attackers' faces before they disappeared into the darkness, but couldn't determine whether his shots had found their targets or merely forced the enemy soldiers to seek cover and regroup for another attempt. Martinez engaged with his rifle from the foxhole's left side, his shots spaced carefully to conserve ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire that might discourage additional frontal attacks. But the Japanese were not discouraged. They were desperate to break through the American defensive line before dawn brought Marine air support and naval gunfire that would turn their night assault into a daylight slaughter. Within minutes of the first attack, enemy soldiers were approaching their position from 3 directions simultaneously, using fire and maneuver tactics that indicated professional military training, rather than the fanatical but poorly coordinated charges that American propaganda had led many Marines to expect. These were Special Naval Landing Force troops, the elite of Japanese amphibious forces, trained specifically for night operations and close-quarters combat against dug-in defenders. Ahrens fired his last rifle ammunition during the second assault, emptying his final 8-round clip into shadows that moved with practiced stealth through the vegetation surrounding their foxhole. The familiar ping of the empty clip ejecting from his Springfield's action marked the end of his ability to engage targets at any meaningful range, leaving him with only his .45 caliber pistol and 7 rounds of ammunition that would be effective only at point-blank distance. Martinez was in similar condition, having exhausted his rifle ammunition and switched to grenades that he threw blindly into the darkness. Hoping to disrupt Japanese movement rather than achieve direct casualties against enemies he couldn't see clearly enough to target precisely. Peterson had lost consciousness from blood loss, slumping against the foxhole's rear wall with his rifle fallen from nerveless fingers, leaving 2 effective Marines to hold a position that was being systematically reduced by enemy fire and infiltration. The Japanese had apparently identified their foxhole as a key strong point that needed to be eliminated before the assault could continue toward the battalion command post, concentrating their efforts against Ahrens and Martinez, while other enemy forces moved past their position to engage targets deeper in the Marine perimeter. The tactical isolation was complete. No communication with friendly forces, no possibility of resupply or reinforcement, and enemy soldiers closing in from multiple directions with the patience and skill of professional killers. The decisive moment came when Martinez's last grenade failed to detonate after landing in thick vegetation that absorbed the explosion's force, leaving them without any weapons capable of engaging targets beyond pistol range. Japanese voices could be heard coordinating their movements just outside effective small arms range, indicating that the enemy was preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the isolated Marine position through sheer weight of numbers and close-quarters violence. Ahrens checked his .45 caliber pistol one final time, ensuring that a round was chambered and the safety was off, while trying to calculate how many enemy soldiers he might be able to engage before being overrun by superior numbers. The final assault began with a shower of Japanese grenades that exploded around their foxhole in rapid succession, filling the air with shrapnel and choking dust that made breathing difficult and visibility even worse than the natural darkness. Through the smoke and debris, Aarons could see enemy soldiers rushing toward their position with bayonets fixed, shouting battle cries that echoed off the surrounding jungle and added to the psychological pressure of combat against overwhelming odds. He fired his pistol methodically, aiming at center mass and trying to make each shot count, but the .45 caliber bullet seemed inadequate against determined attackers who continued advancing even when hit. Martinez went down during the initial rush, struck by multiple bayonet thrusts as Japanese soldiers swarmed into the foxhole and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat that reduced warfare to its most primitive elements. Aarons found himself alone at the bottom of the fighting position, surrounded by enemy soldiers who were trying to finish off the Marine resistance while maintaining momentum for their continued advance toward the battalion rear area. His pistol was empty, Martinez was motionless, Peterson was unconscious, and Japanese soldiers were literally standing over him with bayonets poised to deliver killing blows. That was when Private First Class Edward Aarons reached for the Japanese sword that his fellow Marines had mocked as a useless souvenir, drawing the 30-inch blade from its leather scabbard and discovering that some weapons never become obsolete when survival depends on the willingness to use whatever steel comes to hand. The first Japanese soldier to enter the foxhole learned that American Marines could adapt their fighting methods to match the tactical requirements of close-quarters combat, even when those requirements included medieval weapons wielded with 21st century desperation. The blade that had been forged in traditional Japanese style now turned against its makers, guided by hands that had grown strong carrying rifles and digging foxholes, but were equally capable of wielding ancient steel when modern weapons failed and death seemed certain without immediate, decisive action. Dawn came slowly to Tulagi Island on August 8th, filtering through the jungle canopy as pale gray light that gradually revealed the carnage scattered across Company A's defensive sector. Major Lewis Walt had been moving from position to position since first light, checking on his Marines and assessing the tactical situation after the longest night of fighting in the battalion's brief but violent history. The sounds of combat had finally ceased around 0400 hours, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the calls of tropical birds and the distant crash of surf against the coral reef that surrounded the small island. As Walt approached the right flank positions where the heaviest fighting had occurred, he could see clear evidence of the desperate close-quarters battle that had raged throughout the darkness. Shell casings littered the ground in thick concentrations around Marine foxholes, indicating the volume of fire that had been exchanged during the sustained engagement with Japanese infiltration forces. Abandoned equipment lay scattered across the position: rifles with broken stocks, empty ammunition boxes, shredded cartridge belts, and the distinctive curved magazines from Japanese Arisaka rifles that had been dropped by enemy soldiers during their retreat. The first Marine positions Walt checked had been overrun and then apparently retaken during the confused fighting, with clear signs of hand-to-hand combat in the form of bayonet gouges in coral rock and bloodstains that had turned dark brown in the humid tropical air. 2 Marines from 2nd Squad had been killed defending their foxhole, their bodies lying beside 3 Japanese soldiers who had died in the same small crater that barely measured 6 feet across and 3 feet deep. The intimate scale of infantry combat was always shocking to observe in daylight, when the grand strategic concepts reduced to individual human beings killing each other with knives and rifle butts in holes they had dug with their own hands. But it was the foxhole assigned to Aarons, Martinez, and Peterson that stopped Major Walt completely as he crested the slight rise that overlooked the company's most vulnerable sector. Even from 30 yards away, he could see that something extraordinary had occurred at this position during the night's fighting, something that went beyond the normal brutality of close-quarters combat between trained soldiers fighting for survival. The foxhole itself was nearly invisible beneath a pile of bodies that had to be counted twice before Walt could accept the evidence of his own eyes. 13 Japanese soldiers lay dead in and around the small defensive position, their bodies arranged in rough concentric circles that suggested they had died while attempting to overwhelm a central point of resistance. Walt approached the position carefully, his .45 caliber pistol drawn and ready despite the apparent absence of any remaining enemy forces in the immediate area. The tactical situation could still be dangerous if wounded Japanese soldiers were feigning death, or if additional enemy forces remained hidden in the surrounding jungle, waiting for American officers to expose themselves while investigating the results of the night's fighting. But as he drew closer to the foxhole, Walt realized that no deception was involved. The Japanese soldiers were genuinely dead, their bodies bearing wounds that indicated fierce hand-to-hand combat rather than the clean holes typically produced by rifle bullets or shrapnel from explosive devices. At the center of this circle of enemy dead, slumped against the foxhole's rear wall, sat Private First Class Edward Ahrens, covered in blood from head to foot, but still breathing despite wounds that would have killed most men several times over. His uniform was slashed in dozens of places where bayonets and knives had penetrated the fabric, and his hands were cut badly enough that bone was visible through torn flesh. But his eyes were alert and focused on Major Walt's face as the officer knelt beside him in the cramped fighting position. Martinez and Peterson lay nearby, both clearly dead from multiple wounds sustained during the early phases of the assault, leaving Ahrens as the sole survivor of what had obviously been an epic last stand against overwhelming odds. In Ahrens's hands, still gripped with the desperate strength of a man who had refused to surrender even when death seemed certain, was the Japanese sword that his fellow Marines had mocked as a useless souvenir throughout their training and voyage to the Solomon Islands. The blade was covered with blood that had dried to a dark crust in the tropical humidity, and close examination revealed nicks and scratches along its edge that indicated extensive use against hard targets during sustained combat. 2 Japanese soldiers lay dead inside the foxhole itself, an officer whose rank insignia identified him as a lieutenant, and a non-commissioned officer whose equipment suggested he had been leading an assault team tasked with eliminating key Marine defensive positions. Walt counted the enemy dead methodically, moving from body to body and examining wounds that told the story of a desperate fight conducted with ancient weapons in an age of modern warfare. 11 Japanese soldiers lay scattered in a rough semicircle extending 15 yards from the foxhole's forward edge, their bodies bearing the deep cuts and puncture wounds characteristic of edged weapon attacks rather than gunshot injuries. The tactical picture became clear as Walt reconstructed the engagement. Ahrens had somehow held this position alone after his comrades fell, using nothing more than a captured sword to defeat an entire enemy assault team that had been tasked with breaking through the Marine perimeter. The physical evidence supported an almost incredible conclusion. One young Marine from Kentucky, armed with a weapon that belonged in a museum rather than a battlefield, had single-handedly stopped a coordinated Japanese attack that could have rolled up the entire right flank of Company A's defensive line. The tactical implications were staggering. If this position had been overrun, enemy forces could have established a foothold inside the raider perimeter and used it as a base for follow-up attacks that might have driven the entire battalion back to the beaches, where they would have been vulnerable to Japanese artillery and air attacks. As Walt knelt beside the wounded Marine, Ahrens struggled to speak through lips that were split and swollen from the beating he had taken during the prolonged hand-to-hand combat. His voice was barely a whisper, forced through a throat that might have been damaged by shrapnel or a grazing bullet, but his words carried clearly in the tropical morning air that still held the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. "Major," he said, his eyes never leaving Walt's face, "the bastards tried to come over me last night. I guess they didn't know I was a Marine." Those were the last words Private First Class Edward Henry Ahrens spoke before succumbing to wounds that no medical aid could have treated, even if a full surgical team had been standing by in the foxhole with him. He died in Major Walt's arms as the sun rose over Tulagi Island, still clutching the Japanese sword that had proven more valuable than all the modern weapons his unit carried, the blade that had turned a mocked souvenir into the instrument of one of the most remarkable individual actions in Marine Corps history. The immediate tactical situation on Tulagi stabilized by mid-morning as surviving elements of the 3rd Corps Special Naval Landing Force withdrew to prepared positions deeper in the island's interior, abandoning their night infiltration strategy after losing too many men to continue effective offensive operations. Major Walt's Company A consolidated their defensive perimeter and began the grim task of collecting American dead and wounded, while Japanese bodies were searched for intelligence documents that might reveal enemy strength and intentions for future operations. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion had successfully established their foothold on the island, but the cost had been higher than anticipated, with 14 Marines killed and 37 wounded during the night engagement that would be remembered as one of the most vicious close-quarters battles in the early Pacific campaign. Word of Ahrens' last stand spread quickly through the battalion as Marines from other companies moved through Company A's sector and witnessed the scene that Major Walt had discovered at dawn. The tactical details were impossible to ignore. 13 enemy dead around a single foxhole, 3 American casualties, including 1 man found clutching a Japanese sword, and clear evidence of prolonged hand-to-hand combat that had prevented a potentially catastrophic breakthrough in the Raider defensive line. Marines who had joked about Ahrens' souvenir weapon during training exercises now spoke in hushed tones about the farm boy from Kentucky who had held his position when modern weapons failed and survival depended on ancient steel wielded with desperate courage. The story took on mythic proportions as it passed from unit to unit throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, growing in the telling as combat veterans shared accounts of individual heroism that helped maintain morale during the brutal fighting that characterized the Solomon Islands battles. Marines facing their own desperate situations would remember Aarons's example and find strength in the knowledge that ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The psychological impact extended beyond mere inspiration. It demonstrated that American forces could match Japanese soldiers in close-quarters combat, dispelling fears that Asian enemies possessed some inherent advantage in hand-to-hand fighting that Western troops could never overcome. But the official military bureaucracy moved more slowly than battlefield legend, requiring documentation and witness statements before individual acts of heroism could be formally recognized through the award system that governed military decorations. Major Walt submitted his initial report within 72 hours of the engagement, describing Aarons's action in clinical terms that captured the tactical significance while avoiding the emotional language that might undermine the credibility of his account. The Marine Corps required corroborating evidence for high-level awards, and Walt spent weeks interviewing survivors and collecting physical evidence that would support his recommendation for posthumous recognition of Aarons's extraordinary courage under fire. The investigation revealed additional details that had been obscured by the confusion and darkness of the night engagement. Japanese documents recovered from the enemy dead indicated that the assault team attacking Aarons's position had been specifically tasked with eliminating key defensive positions that could provide supporting fire for the main Japanese attack against the battalion command post. The enemy officer killed in Aarons's foxhole carried detailed sketches of Marine defensive positions, suggesting that the Japanese had conducted thorough reconnaissance before launching their coordinated night assault. Failure to neutralize positions like Aarons's foxhole had doomed the entire enemy operation to costly failure that left the 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force too weak to mount additional offensive operations against the raider perimeter. Intelligence analysis confirmed that Aarons had single-handedly disrupted a carefully planned enemy operation that could have changed the tactical situation on Tulagi and potentially threatened the entire American landing in the Solomon Islands. His individual action had implications far beyond the immediate tactical level, contributing to strategic success that enabled follow-up operations against Japanese positions throughout the island chain. The captured enemy documents also revealed that Japanese forces had specifically identified Marine Raider units as elite troops requiring special attention, indicating that the 3rd Cure Special Naval Landing Force had committed their best assault teams to the night attack that Aarons had helped defeat. Months passed as the awards process ground through military bureaucracy that required multiple levels of review and approval before posthumous decorations could be authorized for individual actions that occurred during larger engagements. The Pacific War continued at an accelerating pace, with American forces advancing across the Central Pacific, while public attention focused on major battles involving thousands of troops, rather than individual acts of heroism that occurred within those larger campaigns. But Marine Corps leadership recognized that maintaining unit morale required formal recognition of extraordinary courage, and Aarons's case represented exactly the kind of individual sacrifice that deserved the highest level of military decoration available for enlisted personnel. On March 13, 1943, more than 7 months after his death on Tulagi, Private First Class Edward Henry Aarons was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism while serving with Company A, 1st Marine Raider Battalion during action against enemy Japanese forces on Tulagi, British Solomon Islands, on August 7th and 8th, 1942. When his position was attacked by a large group of the enemy, Private First Class Aarons, single-handed, engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the Japanese troops, and although mortally wounded in the encounter, succeeded in killing the officer in command of the enemy group and 2 other Japanese, thereby breaking up the attack on his sector of the line." The formal language of military citations could never capture the full emotional and tactical significance of what had occurred in that foxhole during the desperate hours before dawn, but the Navy Cross represented official recognition that Aarons's action had contributed meaningfully to American victory in one of the Pacific War's early and crucial engagements. More importantly for the Marines who had served with him, the decoration validated their belief that ordinary men could achieve extraordinary results when circumstances demanded the ultimate sacrifice in service of their comrades and their country. Later that same year, the United States Navy commissioned destroyer escort DE-575 and named her USS Ahrens in honor of the young Marine who had demonstrated that courage and steel could overcome superior numbers when survival depended on refusing to surrender. The ship served throughout the remaining years of the Pacific War, carrying Ahrens' name and memory into combat operations that ultimately led to Japanese surrender and American victory. For the Marines who remembered the farm boy from Kentucky, who had carried a Souvenir sword into combat, the ship represented a fitting tribute to a warrior who had proven that weapons were only as effective as the hands that wielded them and the heart that guided those hands when death seemed certain and retreat was impossible.